I want to thank all of you for coming today. I want to thank Seattle Escribe because they are also the co-sponsors of this event. And of course my husband here, who draw the maps, because each chapter of the book has a map. And those maps are very useful to understand the plot, because the story, the frame story, is a travel through different countries in the Mediterranean, North Africa. Originally, I wrote this book in Spanish. It's my language. It comes easier for me. But obviously, the editor wanted something in English. They don't read Spanish. So I did my own translation, and Elisa corrected it in a way that I could present it to the editor. And of course, I'm very grateful also for the bookstore. Karen Alman is not here, but she was the one that made available this space today for us. And mainly Hupo Books, the editor, because they gave me this opportunity to put together so many things that I learned during those 40 years of reading stories, traditional stories from the Middle East and other traditions. Hupo is, they are an NGO, they are a non-profit organization, and they dedicated to the publishing and dissemination of the so-called traditional stories, wisdom tales. Most of these stories have been written by the late author Idris Shah, who was the person who introduced into the West, well, I would say reintroduced in the West, in this period, the philosophy, the Sufi, Eastern philosophy, and also the idea of the stories as tools for learning. He was from an Afghan origin, was born in India, but taught all his life from England. And I just said reintroduce, because actually this philosophy and this idea of using stories as teaching tools was introduced first in the West during the Middle Ages, like more than 1,000 years ago, during a time that we call the convivencia, the Spanish convivencia. Convivencia means conviviality, more or less, and it's a time when we had these three major religions and cultures that they were working together. They were the Muslim, they were the Jewish that have been in Spain for many centuries, right? The Sephardi Jewish in Spain, and they had the Christians. So that was a very important time in the history of ideas, because these people worked together in translation, mostly in the translation of the classical Greek philosophy, and they also brought all of the science from, well, the Greeks as well, but also from the Indians, right? Because they introduced the concept of the zero, you know, in Spain, in Europe at that time, they were doing multiplication with Roman numbers. Imagine how it was. So it's amazing the importance that this period has in the history of ideas. And this follows, of course, the invasion of the Iberian Peninsula by the Muslims. Yes, in 711 they came to Spain. So in a sense, well, it was great because they translated all of these important books, like they translated Aristotle, and then many of the algebra, you know, algebra come from some Arab there that invented the algebra. So we're suffering with the algebra now. This period, I am mentioning this period specifically because many of the stories that I introduced in this book come from that time, from that period of time. It was really amazing. Now, you may ask, in what lies the importance of the stories? Why we place so much importance to stories as a tool for learning? It's having said, even in the academia and outside academia, that certain stories, they have a power of opening up our minds, broaden our consciousness, but these don't work as we think okay, we are used to for example, the fables, they have the moral at the end, the message. This is not what we're talking about. We're not talking about the stories that have an overt meaning, this means this and that. No, we're talking about stories that they work like a delineation, would say, of what happened in our minds and in what happened in societies. So it's kind of like indirect way of working, of transmitting certain certain idea, right? I'm saying indirect because, well, they work like when you read or you listen a story, you keep it in your mind, in your memory, and they work like a blueprint. So let's say that something happened in your life sometimes, and suddenly you remember the story. Your mental apparatus resort to that knowledge, that repository of knowledge, you say, that is in the story, and then you say, oh yeah, sure, it happened, like that and that person or animal in the story. So it's not really direct. It's not something that tells you what to do, what to think, how to behave, etc. In terms of indirect teaching, I would like to tell you one of the stories that appears, is the second one that appears in the book. It says that there was, once upon a time, so the story starts, there was a couple in Persia, and they owned a parrot. This parrot was very intelligent. He knew how to talk like we do, like humans. He enjoyed conversation. He was very intelligent, but he was living in a cage, in a golden cage. He was fed with the most delicious food, and it was, all the luxury that you can have in a golden cage. He was protected by aggressors, but he didn't have, of course, the thing that he wanted the most, which is freedom. So one day the merchant was preparing a business trip. He was going to India. And then he went to the parrot, remembering that India was the homeland of this parrot. And then he said, well, would you like me to bring you something from there? And the parrot said, yes, bring me my freedom. Oh, this is not in my power, he said. You belong to my wife. What an excuse, right? You belong to my wife. He said, no, ask for something different. So the parrot said, okay, when you go there to India, please look for my relatives and see, you will recognize them, and tell them that I am living in a cage, in a golden cage, that I have all the luxuries possible, but I cannot really fly to get my food. And then ask them, what should I do to have happiness? Well, the merchant was a little bit surprised about this request, but he promised to do it. But he said, how am I going to recognize your relatives? And the parrot said, well, it's very easy. You just go, and when you see some flock that they have my same plumage, those are my people. Well, not my people, you say my relatives, my birds. Very good. So the merchant went to India, and one day he was riding his horse through the jungle and saw a bunch of parrots in a tree, and they really looked like his own parrot back home. So he said, hey birds, listen to me. I bring greetings from a relative of yours. And so the parrots just, stopped chattering and started to pay attention what this human was saying. And then he said, well, I have a parrot in my house, and he wanted me to tell you that he lives in a cage, that he has all the good food, but he cannot have freedom to get the food by himself, that he is very protected from aggressor, but he's in prison. So he wanted me to ask you how to get happiness, how to attain happiness. As soon as the man finished this speech, one of the birds cocked his head like this and like thinking and started to tremble, and he fell senseless on the ground at the merchant's feet. So the man was so upset. Oh heaven, what happened? Probably this parrot is a relative of mine, and it just is dead now because he couldn't stand, bear this kind of news. I'm so sorry. So he tried to revive the bird, but couldn't. And then, covered him with some leaves, and then went very sorrowful, went his way. After he finished his business, he went back to Persia and went to greet his parrot, and the parrot saw his face. I was kind of worried, and then he said, "Did you talk to my relatives?" And the merchant said, "You should have never told me to do that message. You know what happened? One of your relatives just dropped dead at my feet." When the bird heard that, he started to tremble and uttered a cry and fell down on the floor of the cage, senseless. Oh, the merchant was just so horrified. He said, "These creatures may have such a sensitive heart that they cannot stand to hear a death of one of their relatives." Oh, he was so distressed. Imagine a parrot dying like this. Well, he turned away, and then he heard a quack, and the bird was, oh no, I'm sorry. He went to the cage and took the motionless body and put it on the windowsill. And then when he turned, he heard the bird laughing, and then he saw that the bird was flying, and they went back to the nearby tree branch and say, "Thank you for bringing the message. I know now how to be free." So the stories are not for people to interpret, but I cannot help interpreting it. I have to say it's a good example of what is an indirect way of communication, right? Indirect teaching. Now, we may ask why this indirect way of teaching with stories or fables are more effective than just reading a book, a moral book that tells you, how to do things, how to behave, etc. Well, they say that there is a subjective reaction when somebody tells you right away what to do, how to think, etc. And so you will reject it. You will take it as a frontal attack. All of us. It's kind of a natural reaction. So the way the stories, quoting this author, Shah, the stories, he said, they have a way of slipping through these barriers. Now, I have to tell you something about the fables, that they always have a moral, because the stories, as I said, they shouldn't have written any moral. We are the ones that have to interpret, use them, remember. Now, we are very used to the Aesop fables that at the end they say this means this and that, right? Well, I was very surprised to read when I was studying medieval literature to know that Aesop, right? Aesop himself, he didn't write any moral. That was a prerogative of the later editors, including La Fontaine. Some people say that they did this because of qualification, that academics like to say, oh, these are the stories that belong to theme water. These are the stories to belong to the theme deception or self-deception. So they did that for qualification purpose. I do have the impression that they did that because they couldn't help it. Because when we sometimes hear a story, say, oh, that this is, especially academics, they love to write. I would like to tell you also that they're not only stories, fables, parables that work that way, indirect way, also the jokes, because they all belong to what we call the right hemisphere. The jokes are very much used in these traditions, especially when they want to kind of break the linearity of your reasoning, the too much words, too much blah, blah, blah. There is a story that I love, and it belongs to a character. I don't know if you know this character, but it's very common in all the Middle Eastern countries. I'm sure that my friend Iman and Iskandar, they know this character, right? Among the Arabs, it's called Hoja or Hoja. Okay. Among the Jewish Sephardic people, they call Jehoha. And the Turkish people, they call him Nassereddin. And they have, all the cultures, also the Russians, they have Baldiev. And I grew up with the stories told by my grandfather from Italy. It was Bertoldo. So it's always the same character. It's the fool, wise. And it's the one that always surprises you. It gives you an impact because you are trying to follow certain reason and waiting, expecting something, and something else comes. So it kind of like, it's a jolt, when you are in this linear reasoning way of thinking. I have to tell you one of my favorite stories. The story says that this Johan was in England, and he had a booth in a fair, in a Sunday fair. And there was a sign, he had put a sign saying, "We can answer 2 questions for 20 pounds. And some person approached him and said, 20 pounds? This is expensive, isn't it? Yes, indeed. Next question, please. It's not what you exactly expect, right? Now, let me tell you a little bit about the book, other than the stories, about the book. This was not my idea to do this book, but I have been working with Hupo Books for many years as a volunteer, actually, as a Spanish translator. And one day, the director, Sally Mullen, she called me to see if I would like to write a story. I have to invent a story to where I could insert other traditional stories. Well, I said, yes, I want to do it. I mean, this is what I like to do, to invent things. And then I knew that it would be kind of like a challenge, because I have to follow certain, their own instruction, paradigm, right? It was not my own thing. The first one was that I had to have a frame story that would be attractive to teenagers. However, it has to be interesting for adults as well. There you have one. The second was that it has to be in English. That was a hard part because I read in Spanish. And the third one was that the story that I have also the permission of choosing the story that would be inserted inside the frame story. I don't know, everybody's familiar with the Arabian Nights, right? We call it in Spanish the 1001 Nights, which is the direct translation of the Arabic. Wa Laila, Hel wa Laila wa Laila. That means 1001 nights. But when you use the abjad system that the Arab, and I don't know if the Hebrew use the same system, but the Arabs do, they put every letter has a numerical value, and then when you add all of these and in units and decimals or something like that, you come with another number, and then you dismember it, and you come with another meaning. It's amazing what they can do. But the other meaning of these Arabian Nights, or 1001 Nights, the other meaning is the mother of all registries, or the mother of all stories, something like that. So they wanted me to invent a frame story, but of course I couldn't do something complicated, because the Arabian Nights, they have one story inside another story, inside another story, yeah? Like the onion, like you know about the onion, right? Seattle escribe knows about the onion. So I said, well, I can do one frame story, and then we can insert the individual stories in each chapter very well. But the other condition was that the stories cannot be just any old stories from Middle Eastern or North Africa. It has to be a story that contains certain internal dynamic that would help people to understand themselves, to understand the situation, to have certain meaning, right? Well, I knew my sources. I knew first of all, of course, the Arabian Nights is the mother of all stories. Now, I had a problem there because you might know that the Arabian Nights is not a book, or they are not stories, they have been added through the centuries from different anonymous authors, not just one. It was just through many centuries. But they were not written for children, for kids. They were written for adults. They were being told in the caravanserais for the merchant, slaves, travelers, all kind of people, no children. And some of them really, they could belong to the collection of pornographic stories. So I had to reject many of them. If you are interested, read the first one, The Girl and the Porter, The Three Girls and the Porter. That is something. I won't tell that story because it's not the place to do that. But it's interesting. So I had to reject many stories, but I was fortunately enough, well, I have enough time to look for many stories. And I found several of them that they are good. They would pass any high school text selection board, for example. They will be okay. And also that they are not common to us. I mean, it's not Alibaba or Aladdin and the lamp or the Sinbad and the sailor. They are pretty much unknown. So I was very happy to that I found stories that I could really rewrite, obviously. No, I read it I didn't read in Arabic. I don't know Arabic, but I read in English. And well, I'm glad that I could present that collection to you. So that was my first source. The second source was the most fruitful one, the best one, was the Masnavi by Jalaluddin Rumi, who was a Sufi poet from the 13th century, from Afghan origin, but he taught in Turkey, I think, but he wrote in Persian. Believe it or not, Rumi is one of the most sold and read books of poetry in the United States. At least that was true like 7 years ago when I was reading some articles. It's amazing how much people like this author. Anyway, many of the stories that I have in the book came from the Masnavi book in poetry, full of stories. The third source were, of course, my Spanish collections, because I knew them well, because it was my specialty, so I know how many of these stories are coming from the Middle East. Not only Spanish, well, we're talking about Moorish Spanish, right? From the 8th century to the 15th century, because they were spelled, right? Once I have these sources, my work was to see, well, where I'm going to insert these stories. I had to make it, fluent. They had to have something to do with the main story. Now, at this point, you may say, well, what is the main story after all? Well, the main story is a travel. It takes place in the year 2036. When they asked me to write this umbrella frame story, I wrote 5 different plots, and the editor chose 2. And I was very happy that they let me choose the last one. And the last one, it served me to satisfy my own agenda, let's say, because there are 2 topics that I wanted to talk to young people, and they are very dear to my heart. One of them is global warming and climate change, and the other theme is racial respect, racial diversity and respect. So what I did was to have 2 young heroes. One of them, Jamal, the son that is talking to the father in the first page, Jamal is the son of a refugee from Syria that supposedly have been running away from Syria in 2010 and found a refugee place in Spain. And the father is a scientist, and Jamal is the hero, the young hero. The mission of this Jamal father, he was a scientist and also a captain, and they had to go with a boat through places through the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean up to the Antarctic to study climate change. The other character is a young girl from Mauritania. She comes from a long chain of storytellers, and she's a mixed race. She's Berber and from a African tribe, so it's a black girl, and that allowed me to kind of like counteract a little bit of these two problems that I see right now. One of them is, as you know, there is a certain sector of the population that denies the scientific proof behind climate change. And the other one is the terrible animosity that we have against immigrants. We know that very well, and other people from other races. Very good. I am going to finish. Okay, if I have more time, I'm going to tell you something that is interesting to me, and it has been actually fascinating, and it's the relation between the stories, as much as the poetry and anything that is a creative activity, with the right hemisphere of the brain. And I want to ask people who are very much of experts here. There are psychology, there are other therapists, people who know more than me about the two brains. What happened is that we have heard that many times, right? It's just part of the pop culture to say, oh, I am left brain, I'm right brain. If you're creative, right. If you are more a rational person, to the left. I mean, it's an oversimplification. However, there is something true about that. The truth is that without the right hemisphere that is responsible for symbols and metaphors, we wouldn't be able to be creative. This is where the stories come from. Now, there are some people who say that in the past, we had these two hemispheres kind of in certain balance. The imbalance started when the Greeks invented the alphabet. Well, they were not the Greeks, were the Phoenicians, but the Greeks developed it, right? So the alphabet is sequential. So it seems that there was a mental shift after that time. And the left hemisphere, the neurologists said, have been overdeveloped, I would say, in detriment to the right one, who is the creative, who is the one that knows poetry, who is the one that understands metaphors. After the Greeks, there was another time that was very, prevalent with this kind. This shift happened mostly during the 18th century, during the so-called Enlightenment. Well, I would say that stories help us to recover a little bit that balance that we have lost. As much as poetry, I'm talking about good poetry, of course. Mention the name of this book that my husband has been raving about, and I got a lot of ideas about left and right. It's called The Master and Its Emissary. It seems that the master is the right brain and the left is the emissary, but something happens during our history where the emissary took over, and now he thinks that is the master. I see that example in many occasions in life, even happened to me not long ago, and then I saw a picture in the New York Times. Actually, my husband saw a picture and gave it to me. It's called, this author is called Ian McGilchrist. That's his name.
Ian McGilchrist.
That's his name. And then he goes about the usurpation of the left hemisphere, the rational one, the usurpation of the right one. So, of course, we need the reasoning, we need the logic, because otherwise we wouldn't have science, we need it. However, we cannot forget the other part. And the bad things happen when the left hemisphere takes over the right one, what it doesn't belong to. So I want to show you this picture. I don't know if you can see from there. Here there is a very small picture, and this is Van Gogh's Starry Night. Now here is an essay, and it's the comments, the academic study of the picture. So, who is the master here, right? This is something that happens very often. I would like to finish with a little story, because I like stories, and it's probably the one before the last in my book, and has to do with intuition that we're talking about, because these stories, they appeal mostly to your intuition. The story is called The Three Travelers and the Nun. It says that there were three companions that they set on a travel together, but they had very little money. With the money that each of them had, they couldn't buy anything. So they had this idea of pulling, resources. At least they could buy a piece of bread, a naan, this flat bread, a naan. And then, well, they agree with that. It was a good idea. But they say, well, it's better to leave it for next day. So they went to sleep on the side of the road. In the morning, one of them says, this bread is too small. Everybody's going to be hungry if we divide it in three. And the others say, I agree with you, it's too small. So what we're going to do? And the first man said, well, I have an idea. Why don't we tell each other our dreams? And the one that had the best dream, the most marvelous dream, will eat the naan. Very good. So the first one, the one that had the idea, said, I dreamed that I was in a magic mountain, so tall, that I was able to see God and the angels. And he looks around, because who can have a more marvelous dream than that? The second one said, I dreamed that I was flying in a magic carpet, and I saw not only God and the angels, but I saw all the universe. I saw all the creation, whatever was under the earth and above the earth. I did see the whole creation. And he was a winner. And the third man said, well, I dreamed that I have a visitor, and this visitor was the called invisible guide. And this invisible guide told me that because I am a humble man, I deserve the naan. So he ordered me to wake up, open my eye, woke up and go and eat the bread. And I did it.
Oh my God.
So, this is, right. Okay, I hope that I have chosen the right stories for you, for my grandchildren, for teenagers and for adults as well. And thank you very much. This is the time for you to ask a question.